we're starting off where we ended up in the last lecture. Was we ended off with the discussion with Polemachus and Thrasymachus roaring in to the discussion, and very angrily like a lion. And so what we're going to talk about for the first half of today is the discussion with Thrasymachus and what happens in that discussion with Thrasymachus and why it's important and so forth. But in order to do that, to really talk about what's going on in the Thrasymachus section correctly, we'll need to talk about two important Greek concepts, one being virtue and the other being crafts. Because if you've done the reading, you'll know that virtue and crafts are very much at the center of this entire argument. Unless we know what they mean, we're not going to be able to discuss what's going on. Now, I think there's a danger in reading this part of the dialogue of saying, well, those are just kind of old Greek concepts. We don't have concepts like that anymore. We don't talk that way. We don't think that way. But in fact, what I'm going to try to show when I go through these definitions is show that these really are contemporary ideas as well as ancient ideas and do very much map on to the way we think today, even if we don't actually use the language of virtues or language of crafts really much outside of summer camp, as much as they did. Of course, the words aren't actually in English. So I'm going to start with virtue, and then I'll move on to craft. The word that is virtue is this arete. And I put that actually on the board on Tuesday, but I'll put it up again since I'll be talking about it. And it's a word that's sometimes translated excellence. And one of the reasons that it's sometimes translated excellence is that in Greek this is a word that doesn't just apply to people. This is a word that applies also to things. So a knife can have a virtue, or a knife can have an arete. A horse can have virtue or arete. And of course in English we would never say that a knife has virtue. That doesn't make any sense. It sounds silly. So what we would do instead is we would say that the knife is excellent. Right? And there's something about saying there's excellent that maps on nicely to this Greek concept. So sometimes people prefer to translate it excellence. Sometimes people prefer to translate it virtue. I'm a bit torn myself. But when it comes to people, what it tends to mean in Greek is something like positive character trait. So when it comes to human beings, what it tends to mean is something like positive character trait. And occasionally positive trait, but usually positive character trait. And this is something that we believe in now. We believe in general there are positive character traits. And I'd suggest that sort of any moral theory, or almost every moral theory, does have some sense of what would be a positive character trait. There is not so much disagreement about the meaning of positive character trait as about what actually constitutes a positive character trait. So there's wildly different beliefs about what are the positive character traits, but again, no one really disputes that there are positive character traits. So just to give you some examples in sort of Homeric Greek morality, being strong and intelligent allowed you to protect your friends and crush your enemies. So strength and intelligence were considered virtues. Arete, that's the plural of arete. They were virtues. Strength and intelligence. But let's say, for example, that you were some kind of egoistic hedonist, someone who believes that pleasure is the only good and everyone should be selfish. Okay, so you've got kind of the very different kind of view. Well, then what are the positive character traits? Well, you'd have the ability to successfully calculate what will lead to the most pleasure and the courage to do what is necessary to get the most pleasure. Right? Those would be your positive character traits. So a different theory with different positive character traits. Or let's say that you had some kind of more social justice or fairness type of theory. Well, then the virtues might be something like being compassionate or open-minded or even-tempered or just. Right? These are the various things that you might consider positive character traits. So again, what I'm trying to show here is that very few people, I think, would deny that there are positive character traits. As soon as you start to have a moral theory, you start to believe that certain character traits are positive and certain character traits are not positive. So in this discussion, I think Socrates and Polemachus and Thrasymachus don't disagree about what virtue means. They don't disagree that virtue means positive character traits. If they didn't have an agreement on that level, there'd be no conversation. There'd be nothing, no discussion to have. What they're disagreeing about is what constitutes a virtue. What character traits are positive, as opposed to what character traits are negative. So that's what this dispute's about. This dispute isn't about what virtue means. Everyone in this dialogue really kind of agrees what virtue means. I think probably pretty much everyone agrees what virtue means once they understand the concept. The question is whether or not what character traits actually are virtues. And so far in the dialogue, what we've seen is Socrates and Polemachus having a discussion where every once in a while something would come up that would cast justice in a bad light. So justice might be only useful for useless things, or justice might be a kind of thievery, or so forth. And because these are bad things, and because they believe that justice is a virtue, or a positive character trait, they therefore they therefore will say, okay, well, justice can't be that. There must be something wrong with that definition. That would imply that justice is a bad thing. We all know that justice is a virtue, so therefore there must be something wrong with it. And this is why Thrasymachus coming into the discussion is so important and why it's so different, is he's not going to be susceptible to that kind of argument. And he's not susceptible to that kind of argument because he denies that justice is a virtue. What Thrasymachus is trying to claim, and what makes Thrasymachus different, is that he thinks justice is not a virtue. He thinks it is not a positive character trait. So that's the first of the two conversation topics that need to be defined before we go on. The second is crafts. And crafts, you might see this sometimes translated as expertise, art, but the Greek word is techne. Techne. From which we get our word technology. In fact, technology might be a good way to think about what techne is. It's a kind of productive expertise. It's having the knowledge to be able to make something. And this really is a fundamental concept in Greek. The techne is all over Plato. It's all over Aristotle. Less so Aristotle, but all over Plato. And a lot of it in Aristotle too. And it's also a fundamental modern conception. And what I would say is that techne, or craft, in the Greek conception is actually quite similar to our modern conception once we sort out what everybody means. And one way to sort of clarify what a techne is to contrast it with science. To contrast technology with science, to contrast what in the Greek is techne and what in the Greek is episteme, which I also put on the board last time, but let's do it again. So, what's the difference? Well, sciences are divided up according to their subjects. So human biology is a study, well, biology is the study of living things. Human biology is the study of human beings. Astronomy is the study of the stars. Geology is the study of the earth, and so on. Notice how we divide up the sciences. We divide them up according